Have you ever stood in a room full of people who came to celebrate the happiest day of your life, only to realize that the person you were about to marry has vanished into thin air? Have you ever felt your heart shatter into a million pieces while wearing a beautiful white dress and holding a bouquet of roses that suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds? Let me tell you something that changed my life forever. Something that nearly destroyed me but ultimately saved me from a fate I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how being left at the altar became the greatest blessing in disguise I've ever received. I know that sounds absolutely insane right now, and trust me, I thought I was losing my mind when I first started to understand what had really happened. But I need you to hear this story from beginning to end, because it might just save someone you love from making the same mistakes I almost made. The day was supposed to be perfect. Absolutely perfect. June 23rd, a Saturday afternoon with clear blue skies and the kind of sunshine that makes everything look like it's been touched by magic. I had dreamed about this day since I was a little girl, and every single detail had been planned down to the second. The venue was this gorgeous garden estate with white columns and flowering vines that cascaded down like nature's own wedding decoration. We had 200 guests, people who had traveled from all over the country to witness me marry the man I thought was my soulmate, my forever, my everything. I remember standing in the bridal suite, looking at myself in the full-length mirror, and thinking that I had never felt more beautiful in my entire life. My dress was this stunning lace creation, with a cathedral train that flowed behind me like a river of ivory silk. My hair was swept up in an elegant updo with tiny pearls woven throughout, and my makeup was flawless, highlighting my eyes in a way that made them sparkle with excitement and joy. My bridesmaids were buzzing around me, adjusting my veil, making sure every detail was absolutely perfect, and my mother was standing in the corner with tears streaming down her face, telling me how proud she was and how much she loved me. But there was this tiny knot in my stomach, this little voice in the back of my mind that kept whispering that something wasn't quite right. I pushed it down, told myself it was just normal wedding day jitters, just the natural nervousness that every bride feels before walking down the aisle. I mean, who wouldn't be nervous about making such a monumental commitment, right? I took deep breaths, practiced my smile in the mirror, and kept repeating to myself that in just a few hours, I would be Mrs. Marcus Reynolds, and my life would officially begin. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that magical golden hour when the light is soft and romantic, and everything looks like it belongs in a fairy tale. At 3:30, my wedding coordinator came into the bridal suite with her clipboard and her headset, giving me the 15-minute warning with a bright smile that was supposed to be reassuring, but somehow made my stomach tighten even more. She told me that guests were seated, the string quartet was playing beautifully, and everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. She didn't mention Marcus, and I remember now that her smile seemed a little forced, a little too enthusiastic, like she was trying to overcompensate for something. But I didn't question it because I was too busy trying to calm my racing heart and remember to breathe. At 3:45, we were supposed to start lining up for the processional, but the coordinator came back in, and this time her expression was different. She looked worried, confused, and she was speaking rapidly into her headset while avoiding eye contact with me. My maid of honor, Jessica, asked what was wrong, and the coordinator just kept saying everything was fine, that there was just a small delay. Nothing to worry about, just a minor timing issue that would be resolved in a few minutes. But I could see the panic starting to creep into her eyes, and that knot in my stomach grew into a full-blown sense of dread that made me feel like I couldn't breathe. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20, and the excuses kept changing. First, it was a problem with the sound system. Then it was the officiant running late. Then it was Marcus needing a few more minutes to compose himself because he was so emotional. And I stood there, surrounded by my bridesmaids who were trying to keep me calm and distracted, feeling the weight of my dress getting heavier and heavier with each passing second. My mother kept insisting everything was fine, that Marcus was probably just as nervous as I was, that men sometimes need a moment to collect themselves before making such a big commitment. But deep down, in that place where we always know the truth even when we don't want to admit it, I knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. At 4:30, exactly 30 minutes after our ceremony was supposed to begin, Marcus's best man, Derek, came into the bridal suite. I will never forget the look on his face as long as I live because it was a mixture of pity, anger, and complete shock. He couldn't even look me in the eye at first, and when he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. He told me that Marcus was gone, that he had left the venue, that he wasn't coming back, and that he had left a note saying he couldn't go through with it. Just like that, with less than 50 words, my entire world collapsed around me. I didn't cry immediately because I think my brain couldn't process what was happening, like it was too enormous and too devastating for my mind to fully comprehend all at once. I just stood there, frozen in my beautiful wedding dress, holding my bouquet of white roses and peonies, staring at Derek like he was speaking a foreign language. My bridesmaids started crying. My mother let out this sound that I can only describe as a wounded animal's cry. And the room erupted into chaos as everyone started talking at once, asking questions that nobody had answers to, trying to figure out what we were supposed to do next. Someone had to go out and tell the 200 guests that there would be no wedding, that the groom had left, that everyone could go home. I couldn't do it because I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stand there and feel my heart breaking into pieces so small I didn't think they would ever be able to fit back together again. The wedding coordinator and Derek went out to make the announcement, and I could hear the gasps and murmurs through the walls, could imagine the looks of shock and pity and gossipy curiosity on all those faces. People I loved, people I barely knew, family members, friends, co-workers, all of them now witnesses to my ultimate humiliation and heartbreak. My best friend Jessica was the one who finally got through to me, who took my face in her hands and made me look at her, who told me that we needed to get me out of this dress and out of this venue before I completely fell apart. She was right, because I could feel it building inside me, this tsunami of emotion that was going to crash over me and drown me if I didn't get somewhere private, somewhere safe, somewhere I could collapse without an audience. We got back to my apartment somehow, though I don't really remember the drive because I think I was in shock, my mind protecting itself by shutting down all non-essential functions. Jessica helped me out of my wedding dress, and I remember looking at it hanging on the back of my bedroom door. This beautiful, expensive gown that was supposed to be the costume for the happiest day of my life, but had instead become a symbol of my complete and utter devastation. I finally started crying then. Really crying. The kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere so deep inside you that it feels like it's tearing you apart from the inside out. I cried for hours, until my eyes were swollen shut, and my throat was raw, and my entire body ached from the force of my grief. Jessica stayed with me through all of it, holding me while I fell apart, bringing me water and tissues, not trying to make me feel better because she knew there were no words that could fix this, just being there so I wouldn't have to be alone in my devastation. The next few days were an absolute blur of humiliation and heartbreak that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I had to call vendors and cancel everything, had to listen to the pity in their voices as they processed refunds and expressed their condolences like someone had died. And in a way, someone had died because the version of me who had believed in fairy tale endings and happily ever after was gone forever, replaced by someone who felt like a fool for ever believing that love could be real and lasting and true. The worst part was dealing with the questions from everyone who had been at the wedding or heard about what happened. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls and texts from concerned friends and family members, all wanting to know if I was okay, if I had heard from Marcus, if I knew why he had done this. But I didn't have answers because Marcus had completely vanished, had blocked my number, had deleted all his social media accounts, had essentially erased himself from my life as thoroughly as if he had never existed at all. The note he left with Derek was painfully short and infuriatingly vague, just 3 sentences that said he couldn't go through with the wedding, that he was sorry, and that I deserved better than what he could give me. That was it. That was all the explanation I got for why my entire life had been destroyed. No real reason, no detailed explanation, just empty words that meant absolutely nothing and explained even less. I spent hours analyzing those 3 sentences, trying to read between the lines, trying to find some hidden meaning that would make sense of what had happened. What couldn't he go through with? Why did I deserve better? What couldn't he give me? But no matter how many times I read those words, they remained frustratingly meaningless, just empty platitudes from a man who didn't have the courage to face me and tell me the truth. I started replaying our entire relationship in my mind, searching for clues I had missed, for signs that this was coming, for red flags that I had ignored or overlooked in my eagerness to believe in our love story. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to realize that there had been signs, so many signs that I had dismissed or rationalized away because I was too caught up in the fantasy of our perfect romance. Marcus and I had met 2 years earlier at a company networking event, one of those awkward professional mixers where everyone stands around with drinks trying to make connections while secretly wishing they were anywhere else. I had been there representing my marketing firm, and he had been there representing his investment company, and we had quite literally bumped into each other near the hors d'oeuvres table. He had apologized profusely for almost making me spill my wine, and we had started talking, and I had been immediately captivated by his charm and confidence and the way he seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. He was handsome in that classic way, tall with dark hair and these intense blue eyes that made me feel like I was the only person in the room when he looked at me. We talked for over an hour at that event, and by the end of the night, he had asked for my number and suggested we go to dinner sometime soon. Our first date was magical, absolutely magical. He took me to this upscale Italian restaurant with candlelight and soft music, and we talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told me about his work in finance, about his dreams of starting his own investment firm someday, about his love of travel and adventure and trying new things. He asked me about my career, my goals, my passions, and he actually listened to my answers, asked follow-up questions, made me feel like my thoughts and opinions mattered. By the end of that first date, I was already falling for him, already imagining what a future with this incredible man might look like. Looking back now with the clarity that only comes from hindsight and heartbreak, I can see that our relationship moved incredibly fast, maybe too fast, but at the time it felt exciting and romantic and like fate was pushing us together. We were inseparable from that first date forward, spending every possible moment together, texting constantly when we were apart, falling into that intoxicating early stage of love where everything feels magical and perfect, and like nothing could ever go wrong. Within 3 months, he told me he loved me, and within 6 months, we were talking about moving in together and discussing our future like it was already decided. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner, successful and ambitious and charming, someone who seemed to worship the ground I walked on, and who made me feel like the most special woman in the world. My friends loved him, my family adored him, and everyone kept telling me how lucky I was to have found such an amazing man. When he proposed after a year and a half of dating, I didn't even hesitate before saying yes because I truly believed that I had found my person, my soulmate, the man I was meant to spend the rest of my life with. The proposal itself was straight out of a romantic movie, during a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in wine country, with rose petals and champagne and a gorgeous ring that must have cost a fortune. He got down on one knee and told me that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that he couldn't imagine his life without me, that he wanted to wake up next to me every morning for the rest of his life. And I believed every single word because why wouldn't I? He had given me no reason to doubt him, had been nothing but loving and attentive and seemingly committed to our relationship. We set the wedding date for 10 months later, which seemed like plenty of time to plan the perfect celebration of our love. And that's when things started to get weird, though I didn't recognize it as weird at the time because I rationalized everything as normal stress and the natural complications that come with planning a major event. Marcus became increasingly controlling about the wedding details in ways that seemed odd, but that I convinced myself were just him being particular or wanting things to be perfect. He insisted on being involved in every single decision, from the color of the napkins to the wording on the invitations to the specific flowers in my bouquet. At first, I thought it was sweet that he cared so much about our wedding, that he wasn't one of those grooms who just showed up on the day and let the bride handle everything. But his involvement went beyond normal interest and crossed into something that felt almost obsessive. He would get genuinely upset if I made any decision without consulting him first. Even tiny, insignificant things that traditionally the bride handles on her own. When I chose bridesmaid dresses without showing him first, he actually raised his voice at me for the first time in our relationship, saying that this was our wedding and he needed to approve everything. I apologized and showed him the dresses, and he calmed down and said he was sorry for overreacting, that he was just stressed about work and wanted everything to be perfect for us. I accepted his apology because I understood stress, because I wanted to be understanding and supportive, because I loved him, and I thought this was just a rough patch we were working through together. But the controlling behavior continued and escalated as the wedding got closer. He wanted to know where I was at all times, would get anxious if I didn't respond to his texts within a few minutes, would sometimes show up unannounced at my apartment or my office just to check in. Again, I rationalized this as him being excited and anxious about the wedding, as him wanting to spend as much time with me as possible before we officially became husband and wife. My friends started commenting that he seemed a bit much, that maybe he was being too clingy, but I defended him because I was so deeply invested in our relationship and in the fantasy of our perfect wedding that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. There were other strange things too, things that made me uncomfortable, but that I pushed down because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that something might be wrong with the man I was about to marry. Marcus was very secretive about his finances despite working in finance, which always struck me as ironic. He had told me early in our relationship that he was very successful and made good money, and the evidence certainly supported that because he drove a nice car, wore expensive clothes, took me to fancy restaurants, and bought that gorgeous engagement ring. But whenever I asked specific questions about his work or his financial situation, especially as we were planning to merge our lives together, he would deflect or change the subject or tell me not to worry about money because he had everything under control. When I suggested we should probably sit down and have a serious conversation about our finances before getting married, he got defensive and said that he would take care of everything, that I didn't need to concern myself with those details, that he was the man and it was his job to provide for us. That comment should have been a massive red flag, because I'm a financially independent woman with my own successful career, and the idea that I shouldn't be involved in our household finances was completely ridiculous. But I told myself he was just being traditional, just being protective, just wanting to take care of me the way he thought a husband should. I let it go because I didn't want to fight about money, because so many couples argue about finances, and I wanted us to be different, because I trusted him when he said everything was fine. Another weird thing was how he reacted whenever I mentioned his family or asked about having them more involved in the wedding planning. Marcus had told me early in our relationship that he wasn't very close with his family, that they lived across the country, and that he rarely saw them or talked to them. His parents were supposedly coming to the wedding, but every time I suggested we all get together for dinner or that I should spend some time getting to know them better before we got married, he would make excuses or say they were too busy or change the subject. I had only met them twice, briefly, and both times the interactions had felt strangely formal and uncomfortable, like we were strangers rather than soon-to-be family. His mother had been polite but distant, and his father had barely said 2 words to me. When I mentioned to Marcus that I felt like his parents didn't really like me or approve of our marriage, he assured me that they were just reserved people, that they weren't good at showing emotion, that they absolutely approved and were happy for us. But something about it felt off, felt wrong, felt like there was more to the story that he wasn't telling me. I also noticed that Marcus didn't seem to have any close friends, which is something I should have paid more attention to because I truly believe you can tell a lot about a person by the relationships they maintain. His best man, Derek, was a work colleague rather than a childhood friend or college buddy, and when I asked Marcus about his friends from before he moved to our city, he would give vague answers about losing touch or growing apart or people moving away. Everyone has at least a few people from their past who they stay connected with, right? But Marcus seemed to exist in this weird bubble where his life only included me and his work and nothing else. At the time, I interpreted this as him being completely devoted to me, as him not needing anyone else because he had me. But now I realize how strange and unhealthy that actually was. Have you ever been in a relationship where you ignored the warning signs because you were so invested in the outcome you wanted? Comment below because I need you to understand that I'm not stupid or naive. I'm just a person who wanted to believe in love and who didn't want to see the truth that was right in front of me. The wedding planning process became increasingly stressful as Marcus's controlling behavior intensified and his mood swings became more unpredictable and frightening. There were days when he was the loving, charming man I had fallen in love with, bringing me flowers and telling me how much he loved me and how excited he was to marry me. And then there were other days when he was like a completely different person, irritable and critical and finding fault with everything I did. He would snap at me over tiny things, like the way I folded towels or the route I took to drive somewhere, or the fact that I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. Each time he would apologize afterward, would say he was just stressed about work or the wedding or both, would promise to be better and more patient. And I believed him every single time because I wanted to believe that this was temporary, that once we got through the stress of wedding planning and actually got married, everything would go back to normal and he would be the wonderful man I fell in love with all the time. I started walking on eggshells around him, carefully monitoring everything I said and did to avoid triggering one of his bad moods. I didn't realize it at the time, but that's exactly what abusers do. They train you to manage their emotions for them, to take responsibility for their behavior, to blame yourself when they lash out at you. About 3 months before the wedding, something happened that should have made me call the whole thing off, but I was so deep in denial and so committed to making our relationship work that I rationalized it away like I had rationalized everything else. We were at his apartment, discussing seating arrangements for the reception, and I suggested putting his coworker Tom at a different table than where Marcus had placed him. It was such a minor thing, so insignificant in the grand scheme of our wedding, but Marcus absolutely exploded. He started yelling at me about how I never listened to him, how I always had to have everything my way, how I was being controlling and difficult. I was shocked because I had never seen him that angry before, and I tried to calm him down and explain that I was just making a suggestion, that of course we could do whatever he wanted. But he kept yelling, and then he picked up the seating chart we had been working on and threw it across the room, papers flying everywhere. Then he punched the wall next to where I was standing, and I watched in horror as his fist went through the drywall, leaving a hole and making this awful crashing sound that echoed through the apartment. I stood there frozen, terrified. Seeing this man I thought I knew revealing a side of himself that I had never imagined existed. He looked at his bleeding knuckles, and then at me, and suddenly his expression changed completely. He started crying, actually crying, and apologizing profusely, saying he didn't know what came over him, that he would never hurt me, that he was just so stressed and overwhelmed. He begged me not to leave, told me he would get help, promised it would never happen again. And like an idiot, like someone who had been slowly conditioned to excuse his behavior, I stayed. I convinced myself that everyone has breaking points, that wedding stress brings out the worst in people, that one isolated incident didn't define who he really was. I helped him bandage his hand. I cleaned up the papers, and I agreed to put Tom at the table Marcus had originally chosen. We never spoke about that incident again, and Marcus was extra sweet and attentive for the next few weeks, like he was trying to make up for his outburst. I told myself that this was proof he could change, proof that he was working on managing his stress better, proof that I was right to give him another chance. But deep down, in that place where I was storing all the doubts and fears I didn't want to acknowledge, I was terrified. I started having nightmares about the wedding, dreams where I would walk down the aisle and Marcus would turn around and have this angry, hateful expression on his face, or where I would say my vows and he would laugh at me, or where we would get married and then he would immediately start screaming at me in front of all our guests. I would wake up in cold sweats, my heart pounding, and I would tell myself they were just stress dreams, just my anxiety manifesting in my sleep, nothing to worry about. As the wedding got closer, Marcus became even more controlling about my schedule and my activities, wanting to know exactly where I was going and who I was seeing. He didn't like when I spent time with my friends without him, would pout or make passive-aggressive comments if I had plans that didn't include him. He started criticizing my appearance in ways he never had before, suggesting I should lose a few pounds before the wedding, commenting that maybe I should try a different hairstyle or wear more makeup. Each criticism was delivered with a smile and framed as him just wanting me to look my best on our big day, but they chipped away at my self-esteem and made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I needed to change myself to be worthy of his love. I found myself constantly seeking his approval, showing him my outfits before I left the house, asking if he thought I looked okay, needing his validation to feel attractive or confident. This was completely unlike me because I had always been a confident, independent woman who didn't need anyone's approval to feel good about myself, but Marcus had somehow managed to make me doubt everything about who I was. The week before the wedding was absolute chaos and marked by several incidents that, in retrospect, were massive screaming warnings that I should have heeded. Marcus became obsessed with my phone, constantly asking who I was texting or calling, sometimes even taking my phone and scrolling through my messages when he thought I wasn't paying attention. When I confronted him about it, he said he just wanted to make sure I wasn't getting cold feet or talking to any ex-boyfriends, that he was just being protective because he loved me so much. I told him his behavior was inappropriate and controlling, and we had a huge fight that ended with him crying again and saying he was just insecure because he couldn't believe someone as amazing as me would actually want to marry him. He made me feel guilty for being upset with him, made me feel like I was being unreasonable and unsupportive when he was just expressing his love for me in his own way. Another incident happened at the rehearsal dinner 2 nights before the wedding, and it should have been the final straw that made me realize I was making a terrible mistake. We were all gathered at the restaurant, our families and wedding party, celebrating and giving toasts, and everything seemed fine until my brother made a joke during his toast about how he hoped Marcus knew what he was getting into marrying me, because I can be stubborn and opinionated. It was meant to be lighthearted and funny, the kind of gentle teasing that happens at these events, and everyone laughed, including me. But I saw Marcus's expression darken, saw his jaw clench, and I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. After the dinner, when we were alone in the parking lot, Marcus grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and told me that my brother had disrespected both of us with that toast, that I needed to call him and tell him his behavior was inappropriate. I tried to explain that it was just a joke, that my brother didn't mean anything by it, but Marcus was furious. He said that once we were married, he expected my family to treat him with more respect, that he wouldn't tolerate being made fun of or belittled. The way he said it, the tone of his voice, the grip on my arm, it all made me realize that I was seeing the real Marcus, the one he had been hiding behind the charm and the romance and the grand gestures. I pulled my arm away and told him he was overreacting, that he was hurting me, and he immediately let go and apologized. But there was something different about this apology. It felt perfunctory, automatic, like he was just saying the words he knew he was supposed to say rather than actually feeling sorry for his behavior. I went home that night with a bruise on my arm where he had grabbed me, and I sat on my bathroom floor and cried because I absolutely knew, that I should call off the wedding. But how could I? The wedding was in 2 days. We had 200 guests coming. We had spent tens of thousands of dollars. My dress was hanging in my closet waiting for me. The venue was all set up. Everything was ready. The thought of canceling everything and facing the humiliation and the questions and the judgment felt impossible. Felt like it would destroy me. So I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that Marcus was just stressed like I was stressed, that things would be better after the wedding when all this pressure was finally over. I covered the bruise on my arm with makeup and told myself that I was going to marry this man and make it work, because that's what you do when you love someone. You work through the hard times and you don't give up. The morning of the wedding arrived, and I woke up with this overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried to talk myself out of it. My bridesmaids arrived at my apartment early to start getting ready together, bringing mimosas and pastries and creating the kind of excited, feminine energy that's supposed to make wedding mornings magical and fun. But I felt like I was watching everything happen from outside my body, like I was observing someone else's wedding day rather than living my own. I smiled and laughed at the right moments, participated in the getting ready rituals, allowed the hair and makeup artist to transform me into a bride, but the whole time there was this voice in my head screaming at me to stop, to run, to get out before it was too late. I ignored that voice because I had become an expert at ignoring my intuition, at silencing the part of me that knew the truth. Marcus and I had agreed not to talk or text on the wedding morning because we wanted to preserve the traditional element of not seeing each other before the ceremony. So I hadn't heard from him since the night before when we had said goodnight over the phone. His tone had been strange during that call, distant and distracted. And when I asked if he was okay, he had said he was fine, just tired and ready for tomorrow to finally be here. Now I can recognize that something in his voice should have alerted me, some quality of resignation or dread that I was too caught up in my own anxiety to identify. The bridal suite at the venue was beautiful, exactly as I had imagined it, with huge mirrors and comfortable seating and large windows that let in the afternoon sunshine. I sat in front of the mirror while the makeup artist put the finishing touches on my face, and I stared at my reflection, this bride version of myself that looked perfect on the outside while everything inside was screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong. My mother kept commenting on how beautiful I looked, how this was the happiest day of my life, how proud she was of me, and I wanted to tell her that I was terrified, that I wasn't sure I should go through with this, that I thought I might be making the biggest mistake of my life. But the words wouldn't come out because how do you tell your mother that you're having serious doubts about marrying someone when she's standing there with tears of joy in her eyes and everyone is already seated in the ceremony space waiting for you? You can't, or at least I couldn't, so I kept my doubts locked inside and told myself to just get through the next few hours. When the wedding coordinator came in at 3:30 to give me the 15-minute warning, I noticed that she seemed nervous and kept looking at her phone and speaking quietly into her headset. She told me everything was on schedule, but something in her body language contradicted her words. I asked if Marcus was ready, if everything was okay with the groom's side, and she assured me that everything was fine, that I shouldn't worry about anything except enjoying my special day. But that knot in my stomach that had been there all morning tightened into something that felt like panic, and I had to focus on breathing slowly and deeply to keep myself from hyperventilating. My bridesmaids were chattering excitedly about how gorgeous the ceremony space looked, about how handsome the groomsmen looked in their tuxedos, about how this was going to be the most beautiful wedding ever. Jessica handed me my bouquet, and the weight of it in my hands felt significant somehow, like I was holding something precious that I was about to lose. At 3:45, we were supposed to start lining up for the processional, the carefully choreographed sequence that would culminate in me walking down the aisle to marry Marcus. But instead of the wedding coordinator coming to get us and start the lineup, there was a long silence punctuated only by muffled voices and hurried footsteps outside the bridal suite door. My bridesmaids and I exchanged confused looks, and my mother went to the door to see what was happening. Before she could open it, the coordinator burst back in, and this time she couldn't hide the panic on her face. She was speaking rapidly into her headset, saying things like, "I don't know," and "he's not answering," and "what am I supposed to tell them?" My heart started racing, and I demanded to know what was going on, why we weren't lining up, where Marcus was. She tried to maintain her professional composure, tried to smile and reassure me that there was just a minor delay, that the groom needed a few more minutes, that everything would be fine. But I could see the truth in her eyes. could see that something was very wrong, and I started to feel like the walls of that beautiful bridal suite were closing in on me. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20, and with each passing minute, the excuses got weaker and the coordinator's panic became more obvious. She kept leaving the room to make calls and have urgent whispered conversations with other staff members, and each time she came back and her expression was more worried. My bridesmaids tried to keep me calm, offering me water and fanning me with wedding programs because I had started sweating despite the air conditioning, ruining the perfect makeup that had taken an hour to apply. My mother was making phone calls too, trying to reach Marcus or Derek or anyone who might know what was happening, but nobody was answering. I felt like I was in a nightmare, like I was stuck in that awful moment before something terrible happens when you can feel the disaster approaching, but you can't move or speak or do anything to stop it. At 4:30, when our ceremony was already a half hour late, and the guests must have been confused and concerned and probably gossiping about what was causing the delay, Derek finally arrived at the bridal suite. I knew the moment I saw his face, the way he couldn't look at me directly, the way his shoulders were slumped like he was carrying an impossible weight. I knew that my worst fear was about to be confirmed. He asked if he could speak to me privately, and my mother and bridesmaids started to protest, started to say that whatever he needed to tell me could be said in front of them. But I told them it was okay, and Derek and I stepped out into the hallway, and I stood there in my wedding dress and veil, waiting for him to destroy my life with whatever words were about to come out of his mouth. He was struggling to speak, opening his mouth and then closing it again, looking anywhere but at my face. I finally told him to just say it, to please just tell me what was happening, and he took a deep breath and said, "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but Marcus is gone. He left the venue about an hour ago, and he's not coming back. He asked me to give you this." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, and I took it with shaking hands, unfolding it to read 3 sentences that would haunt me for months afterward. "I can't go through with this. I'm sorry. You deserve better than what I can give you." That was it. That was all the explanation I got for why the man I loved, the man I had built my entire future around, had abandoned me on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I remember staring at those words, reading them over and over, trying to make them mean something more than they said, trying to find some hidden message or deeper explanation. But there was nothing there, just empty words from a coward who couldn't even face me to end our relationship. I asked Derek where Marcus went, and he said he didn't know, that Marcus had blocked his number and wasn't responding to anyone. I asked if Marcus had seemed upset or distressed or given any indication that he was planning to do this, and Derek said that Marcus had seemed anxious all morning, but that he never imagined he would actually leave. I asked Derek if he knew why, if Marcus had told him anything that might help me understand what was happening, and Derek just shook his head and said he was as shocked as I was. I felt like my body was made of glass and someone had just hit me with a hammer, like I was shattering into a million pieces right there in that hallway. But I couldn't fall apart yet because there were 200 people sitting in that ceremony space waiting for a wedding that was never going to happen, and someone had to tell them. Derek offered to make the announcement, and I nodded because I couldn't speak, couldn't form words, could barely breathe. I went back into the bridal suite and everyone could tell from my face that something catastrophic had happened. My mother rushed to me and asked what was wrong, and I just held out the note for her to read. Her reaction was everything I was feeling but couldn't yet express, this animalistic sound of grief and rage and disbelief. She started cursing Marcus, saying we would find him and make him explain himself, saying this couldn't be happening, this wasn't real. My bridesmaids surrounded me, trying to comfort me even though they were crying too, and Jessica took charge of the situation because I was completely incapable of making any decisions or taking any actions. Through the walls, I could hear Derek making the announcement to the guests, could hear the collective gasp and murmur that followed his words. I imagined all those people who had traveled and bought gifts and taken time off work to celebrate with us, now sitting there in shock and whispering about the poor bride who had been left at the altar. The humiliation of it was almost worse than the heartbreak because at least heartbreak is private, something you can experience in the safety of your own home. But this was public devastation, witnessed by everyone I knew, creating a story that would follow me for years, defining me as the woman who wasn't good enough to make her fiancé show up to their own wedding. The aftermath of being left at the altar was even worse than the actual event itself, if that's even possible, because at least on the day of the wedding I was in shock and couldn't fully process what had happened. But in the days and weeks that followed, reality set in with crushing force, and I had to face the complete destruction of my life and my future as I had imagined it. The first few days were spent in a haze of tears and disbelief, lying in bed and refusing to eat or see anyone except Jessica, who had basically moved into my apartment to take care of me because I was completely non-functional. I would wake up every morning, and for a brief, beautiful moment, I would forget what had happened, and then reality would crash back over me like a wave, dragging me under. I had to cancel the honeymoon we had planned, a 2-week trip to Greece that I had been so excited about. And dealing with that travel agent and explaining why we needed to cancel was humiliating beyond words. I had to return wedding gifts, writing notes to guests, thanking them for their generosity and apologizing for the circumstances, each note a fresh reminder of my public humiliation. I had to call my job and explain why I needed to take an extended leave of absence, had to listen to my boss's uncomfortable sympathy, as he told me to take all the time I needed. Everything in my apartment reminded me of Marcus and our failed relationship. From the engagement photos on the walls to the half-empty closet where his clothes used to hang to the stupid matching coffee mugs we had bought on a weekend trip. I couldn't escape him even in my own home, and every single object felt like a knife twisting in my heart. The worst part was dealing with everyone's reactions and questions and unsolicited advice about what I should do and how I should feel. People kept telling me that I was better off without him, that if he could do this to me, then he didn't deserve me, that I had dodged a bullet. And logically, I knew they were probably right. But emotionally, I was still in love with him and missing him and wanting him back even though he had destroyed me. How messed up is that? That even after being left at the altar, I still wanted Marcus to come back and explain and tell me it was all a mistake? I felt pathetic for still loving someone who had hurt me so badly. But you can't just turn love off like a faucet no matter how much you want to. I tortured myself by going over every moment of our relationship, every conversation, every decision, trying to figure out where it went wrong and what I could have done differently. I blamed myself for not seeing the warning signs, for ignoring my instincts, for being too trusting or too naive or too desperate to believe in fairy tale endings. I alternated between grief and anger, sometimes crying for hours, and sometimes fantasizing about confronting Marcus and screaming at him and making him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused me. But I couldn't confront him because he had disappeared completely, had made himself unreachable and unavailable, had denied me even the basic courtesy of an explanation or closure. I tried calling him from different numbers, tried emailing him, tried reaching out through social media even though he had deleted his accounts, but every attempt was met with silence. It was like he had erased not just himself from my life, but our entire relationship. Like the 2 years we spent together and the future we had planned meant absolutely nothing to him. About 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, I forced myself to start functioning again because I couldn't stay in bed crying forever no matter how much I wanted to. I went back to work, though I could barely concentrate, and spent most of my time in the bathroom crying or staring blankly at my computer screen. My coworkers tried to be supportive, but I could see the pity in their eyes, could hear them whispering when they thought I couldn't hear, could feel them treating me differently, like I was fragile and might break at any moment. I was the office tragedy, the woman everyone felt sorry for, and I hated it with every fiber of my being. I started going to therapy because Jessica insisted that I needed professional help to process what had happened, and my therapist was kind and patient as I cried through most of our sessions and tried to make sense of the senseless. She helped me see that what Marcus did was not about me or my worth as a person, that his actions were about his own issues and problems. But knowing something intellectually and actually believing it emotionally are two very different things. And I still felt like I must have done something wrong, must have been lacking in some fundamental way that made Marcus unable to commit to me. I became obsessed with understanding why, with finding an explanation that would make sense of what happened. Because the not knowing was almost worse than the abandonment itself. If I could just understand why he left, if I could identify the specific reason or moment that changed his mind, then maybe I could process it and move on. But without that understanding, I was stuck in this limbo of confusion and hurt with nowhere to direct my pain except inward at myself. My friends and family were amazing during this time, surrounding me with love and support, even when I was difficult and withdrawn, and not always grateful for their efforts. But their support also came with constant check-ins and worried looks and questions about how I was doing that, while well-intentioned, sometimes felt suffocating. Everyone wanted me to move on, to get over Marcus, to start dating again, to prove that I was strong and resilient and not broken by what had happened. But healing doesn't work on other people's timelines, and I needed to grieve the loss of not just Marcus, but the entire future I had imagined, the life I thought I was going to have, the person I thought I was going to become. About a month after the wedding, I was having a particularly bad day, lying on my couch and scrolling through old photos of Marcus and me on my phone, even though I knew it was unhealthy and counterproductive. Have you ever noticed how memory is cruel? how it seems to only remember the good moments and conveniently forgets all the bad ones. Looking at those photos, all I could see was how happy we looked, how in love we seemed, how perfect everything appeared to be. I couldn't reconcile those images with the man who had abandoned me at the altar, couldn't understand how someone who looked at me with such love in those pictures could hurt me so devastatingly. I was so deep in my misery that I almost didn't answer when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. But something made me pick up. Some instinct that this call was important, even though I had no logical reason to think that. The voice on the other end of the line was female, nervous and uncertain, and she asked if I was Sarah Mitchell, if I had been engaged to Marcus Reynolds. I confirmed that I was, my heart starting to race because who was this woman and why was she calling me about Marcus? She introduced herself as Rebecca, and she said she had something important to tell me, something I needed to know about the man I had almost married. Her voice was shaking as she spoke, and I could tell that whatever she was about to say was difficult for her, that she was scared or nervous or both. She asked if we could meet in person because what she had to tell me wasn't something she wanted to discuss over the phone. And even though every logical part of my brain was screaming that this could be dangerous or crazy, I agreed because I was desperate for answers, desperate for any information that might help me understand what had happened. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop, and I spent the entire night unable to sleep, running through scenarios in my mind about who this Rebecca could be and what she might know about Marcus. Was she an ex-girlfriend, a coworker, someone from his past? Did she know where he was? Did she know why he left? The questions multiplied in my mind until I thought I might go crazy from the anticipation and anxiety. The next afternoon, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, too anxious to wait at home any longer, and I sat at a corner table with a clear view of the door so I could see Rebecca when she arrived. I had no idea what she looked like or how I would recognize her, but she had said she would find me. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman walked in who looked around the coffee shop with an uncertain expression, and when our eyes met, I knew this was her. Rebecca was probably in her early 30s, with light brown hair and tired eyes that looked like they had seen too much. She was pretty in an understated way, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, and she approached my table with visible nervousness. We exchanged awkward greetings, and she ordered a coffee before sitting down across from me, and I could see her hands shaking as she wrapped them around her cup. I asked her how she knew Marcus and what she wanted to tell me, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Rebecca took a deep breath and said, "Sarah, I'm Marcus's wife. Well, technically his ex-wife now, but we were married for 5 years, and we only got divorced 6 months ago." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I processed her words. Wife? Marcus had been married? How was that possible when he told me he had never been married before, when we had talked about how this would be a first marriage for both of us? I must have looked as shocked as I felt because Rebecca nodded sympathetically and said she knew this must be a lot to take in, that Marcus was very good at lying and hiding things, that she wasn't surprised he had never mentioned her to me. She went on to explain that their marriage had been troubled almost from the beginning, that Marcus had been controlling and manipulative and psychologically abusive in ways that she only recognized after she finally got out. She said that Marcus had a pattern of being charming and romantic in the beginning, sweeping women off their feet with grand gestures and declarations of love, but that the mask always eventually slipped and the real Marcus, the angry, controlling, sometimes violent Marcus, would emerge. She told me that during their marriage, Marcus had isolated her from her friends and family, had controlled their finances despite telling her he was making good money, had monitored her every move and accused her of cheating whenever she did anything without him. She said she had tried to leave multiple times, but he would always convince her to stay, would promise to change, would be sweet and loving for a few weeks before reverting back to his abusive behavior. It took her years to finally get the courage to leave for good, and even then the divorce process had been brutal, with Marcus fighting her on every point and making threats that terrified her. As Rebecca spoke, I felt like I was going to be sick, because I recognized so many of the behaviors she was describing, behaviors I had seen in Marcus during our relationship, but had rationalized or minimized or explained away. The controlling nature, the mood swings, the isolation, the need to monitor and approve everything I did, it had all been there, and if we had gotten married, I would have been living Rebecca's nightmare. I asked her why she was telling me this now, why she had tracked me down to share this information, and she said that when she heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had gotten engaged again, she had debated whether to intervene or warn me. She had ultimately decided not to because she thought maybe he had changed, maybe I was different, maybe it wasn't her place to interfere in his new relationship. But when she heard that he had left me at the altar, she knew there had to be more to the story, and she felt compelled to reach out and tell me the truth about who Marcus really was. Rebecca said she had been doing some digging, had reached out to people who knew Marcus, and she had uncovered information that I needed to know, information that would help me understand why he ran and why I should be grateful that he did. She pulled out her phone and showed me documents and screenshots that painted a picture of Marcus Reynolds that was completely different from the man I thought I knew. He wasn't a successful investment banker like he had told me. He had been fired from his job 3 months before our wedding for embezzling client funds, and there was an ongoing investigation that would likely result in criminal charges. The expensive lifestyle he had been living, the nice car and fancy dinners and my engagement ring, had all been funded by stolen money and credit card debt that he had racked up to astronomical levels. He was financially ruined and facing possible prison time, and Rebecca believed that the reality of his situation had finally caught up to him the morning of our wedding, that he had panicked and run rather than face the consequences or admit the truth to me. But it got worse, so much worse than I could have imagined. Rebecca showed me a restraining order that his previous girlfriend before me had filed against him, detailing incidents of physical violence and threats that had escalated to the point where she feared for her life. She showed me police reports from multiple women who had dated Marcus over the years, all telling similar stories of charm that turned to control, that turned to abuse. She showed me evidence that Marcus had a gambling addiction that he had hidden from everyone, that he frequented casinos and lost massive amounts of money that contributed to his financial destruction. She showed me records indicating that he had been involved in some questionable business dealings that bordered on criminal, that he had made enemies of some very dangerous people who were looking for him. Each piece of information Rebecca shared felt like another blow, another revelation that shattered my understanding of who Marcus was and what our relationship had been. I had been engaged to a con artist, an abuser, a criminal, someone who had lied about virtually every aspect of his life and identity. The man I loved didn't actually exist. He was a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a much darker reality. Rebecca told me that she believed Marcus had been planning to marry me to gain access to my finances and possibly my credit, that he needed someone stable and successful to help him dig out of the financial hole he had created. She said that when his situation became untenable and he realized he couldn't maintain the facade any longer, he chose to run rather than face the truth. She speculated that there might be other reasons he left, possibly related to the dangerous people he owed money to, possibly because he was about to be arrested, possibly because he was already involved with someone else and planning his next con. The specific reason didn't really matter anymore because the fundamental truth was clear. Marcus Reynolds was not who he said he was, and marrying him would have destroyed my life in ways that made being left at the altar look like a blessing. I sat there in that coffee shop, listening to Rebecca reveal all of this, feeling like I was in a movie or a nightmare rather than my actual life because it all seemed too dramatic and terrible to be true. But the evidence was there, undeniable and documented, and I had to accept that everything I thought I knew about the man I loved was a lie. Rebecca apologized for being the one to tell me all of this, said she knew it must be incredibly painful and shocking, but she felt I deserved to know the truth. She said she wished someone had warned her before she married Marcus, and she didn't want me to spend the rest of my life wondering what happened or blaming myself for his actions. She told me I was lucky, genuinely lucky, that he left when he did because if we had gotten married, I would be legally and financially tied to him and his problems, and extricating myself would have been exponentially more difficult than just dealing with the heartbreak and humiliation of being left at the altar. As the initial shock began to wear off and the reality of what Rebecca was telling me started to sink in, I felt this strange mixture of emotions that I couldn't entirely process or understand. There was relief, incredible, overwhelming relief that I hadn't married this person, that I had unknowingly escaped a fate that would have been devastating. There was anger. So much anger at Marcus for lying to me, for manipulating me, for wasting 2 years of my life on a relationship built entirely on deception. There was embarrassment that I had been so thoroughly fooled, that I hadn't seen through his lies, that I had defended him and made excuses for his behavior when the red flags were so obvious in retrospect. And there was grief, profound grief, for the loss of what I thought we had, even though I now knew it was never real. After meeting with Rebecca and learning the truth about Marcus, I spent several days in a state of shock that was somehow even more intense than what I had felt when he first left me at the altar. It's one thing to be abandoned and heartbroken, but it's another thing entirely to discover that your entire relationship was a lie, that the person you loved never actually existed. I had to completely reframe my understanding of the past 2 years, had to look at every memory and interaction through this new lens of deception and manipulation. Moments that had seemed romantic or meaningful now appeared sinister and calculated, evidence of Marcus playing a role rather than genuinely loving me. The way he had swept me off my feet during our early courtship now seemed like a predator identifying his prey. The controlling behaviors I had rationalized as love or protectiveness now revealed themselves as abuse and attempts to isolate me from people who might have helped me see the truth. Every sweet word and grand gesture had been part of a con, designed to keep me invested and trusting while he worked whatever angle he was playing. I felt like such a fool, like I should have known, like there must have been something wrong with me that I fell for his lies so completely. Jessica reminded me that people like Marcus are expert manipulators, that they're skilled at creating exactly the persona their victim wants to see, that there's no shame in being deceived by someone who has perfected the art of deception over many years and many victims. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop me from feeling stupid and gullible and naive. I kept asking myself how I could have been so blind, how I could have ignored so many warning signs, how I could have allowed myself to be so thoroughly fooled. My therapist helped me understand that I had been targeted by someone who knew exactly what he was doing, that Marcus had likely studied me and identified my vulnerabilities and desires, and then tailored his approach to exploit them. She explained that victims of manipulation and abuse aren't weak or stupid. They're often empathetic, trusting people who want to believe the best about others, and predators specifically seek out these qualities because they make people easier to control. She helped me see that the shame and blame belonged entirely to Marcus, not to me. But changing how I felt about my own role in what happened was a slow and difficult process. Rebecca had given me her contact information and encouraged me to reach out if I had questions or needed support, and over the following weeks we developed an unlikely friendship based on our shared experience of being deceived and hurt by the same person. She introduced me to two other women who had also been in relationships with Marcus, and hearing their stories was both validating and horrifying. We all described similar patterns, similar behaviors, similar red flags that we had each individually dismissed or rationalized. Marcus had clearly been running the same con over and over, finding vulnerable women, overwhelming them with romance and attention, slowly isolating and controlling them, and then either discarding them when they became too difficult to manage or fleeing when his lies caught up to him. The four of us formed a sort of support group, meeting regularly to share our experiences and help each other heal. And their support was invaluable during this time because they were the only people who truly understood what it felt like to be deceived so completely by someone you loved. About 6 weeks after Rebecca first contacted me, we decided collectively that we needed to do something with the information we had about Marcus, that we couldn't just let him continue his pattern of hurting people without any consequences. We compiled all the evidence we had collectively gathered, the restraining orders, the police reports, the financial documents, the testimonies from multiple victims, everything that painted a clear picture of Marcus Reynolds as a dangerous con artist and abuser. We took this evidence to the police and filed a formal complaint, and we were informed that Marcus was already being sought in connection with the embezzlement investigation Rebecca had told me about. The detective assigned to the case told us that Marcus had fled the state and was currently avoiding law enforcement, but that they were actively searching for him and confident they would eventually locate and arrest him. Knowing that Marcus would face legal consequences for at least some of his actions provided a small measure of justice, though it couldn't undo the damage he had done to all of us. The detective also warned us that Marcus might try to contact us, especially if he became desperate or felt cornered, and advised us to be vigilant about our safety. That warning sent a chill through me because I realized that the man I had almost married might actually be dangerous, that his leaving me at the altar might have saved me from much more than just a bad marriage. As more time passed and I slowly began to process everything that had happened, I started to recognize the leaving me at the altar for what it really was, the greatest gift Marcus ever gave me, though I'm certain that wasn't his intention when he did it. If he had gone through with the wedding, I would have been legally bound to a criminal, an abuser, someone who would have systematically destroyed my life, my finances, my sense of self, and possibly my physical safety. The humiliation and heartbreak I experienced from being abandoned at my wedding were temporary pains that would heal, but the damage of being married to Marcus would have been exponentially worse and potentially permanent. Rebecca had told me during one of our conversations that it took her years to recover from her marriage to Marcus, years to rebuild her credit, her confidence, her ability to trust anyone. She said she still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched when men raised their voices, still struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance that were direct results of the abuse she had endured. And she had only been married to him for 5 years. If I had married Marcus, who knows how long it would have taken me to see the truth and find the courage to leave? Who knows what he might have done to me in that time? The physical evidence that Rebecca had shown me, the restraining order with its descriptions of violence, haunted me because I knew that could have been me filing that report, me with bruises or worse, me trapped in a situation where the man I loved was also the man I feared. Every time I thought about the hole Marcus had punched in his wall next to my head, every time I remembered the bruise on my arm from when he grabbed me at the rehearsal dinner, I felt sick knowing that those incidents were likely just previews of what was to come if we had gotten married. Abusers escalate. That's what my therapist told me. They test boundaries and push limits and gradually increase the severity of their abuse as they become more confident that their victim won't leave. Marcus had been testing me, seeing what I would tolerate, and I had passed his tests by staying, by making excuses, by believing his apologies and promises to change. If we had gotten married, he would have known he had me trapped, and the abuse would have gotten worse. I also thought about the financial devastation I had narrowly avoided, how Marcus's debts and legal troubles would have become my problems too if we had been married. I could have lost my savings, destroyed my credit, even potentially faced legal jeopardy if prosecutors decided to pursue me as an accomplice or co-conspirator in his financial crimes. My entire financial future, everything I had worked so hard to build, would have been destroyed by his lies and his choices. And beyond the financial and physical dangers, there was the psychological damage that I had escaped, the slow erosion of my identity and autonomy that happens when you're in a controlling, abusive relationship. I had already started to lose myself during our engagement, already started to doubt my own judgment and defer to Marcus's preferences and seek his approval for everything. If we had gotten married, that process would have continued until I didn't recognize myself anymore, until I was completely subsumed into his will and his needs with no space left for my own desires or thoughts. I would have become a shell of the strong, independent woman I had been before I met him, and recovering from that kind of psychological damage can take years or even a lifetime. So yes, Marcus leaving me at the altar absolutely destroyed me in the moment, absolutely humiliated me and broke my heart and shattered my dreams of the future I thought we would have together. But with the perspective of knowing what I now know, understanding who he really was, and what my life would have become if I had married him, I can honestly say that being left at that altar was the best thing that ever happened to me. It saved me from a marriage that would have been abusive and possibly dangerous, saved me from financial ruin, saved me from years of psychological damage, and the long, difficult process of eventually leaving and rebuilding my life. Marcus running away on our wedding day was an act of cowardice on his part, but it was an act of salvation for me, even though I couldn't see it at the time and even though he certainly didn't intend it that way. The universe, fate, divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, protected me that day by making Marcus's lies catch up to him at exactly the right moment, before I was legally bound to him and his disaster of a life. I know that some people might think I'm just trying to put a positive spin on a terrible experience, just trying to convince myself that everything happens for a reason to make myself feel better about what happened. But I promise you this isn't toxic positivity or denial. This is genuine gratitude born from understanding exactly how much worse my life could have been. I've spoken with enough victims of domestic violence and financial abuse to know that I got out easy, relatively speaking, that standing alone at an altar in front of 200 people is actually a small price to pay for escaping the kind of nightmare that Marcus would have created. The healing process has been long and difficult, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm completely over what happened or that I don't still have trust issues and anxiety about relationships. I do, and probably will for a long time. I've had to learn how to trust my own judgment again, how to believe in my ability to recognize red flags and protect myself, how to be open to love while also being appropriately cautious. I've had to work through the shame and embarrassment, had to learn to tell my story without feeling like I need to justify or defend myself, had to accept that being manipulated by an expert manipulator doesn't make me weak or stupid. I've had to grieve not just for the relationship I lost, but for the innocence I lost, for the version of me who believed that love was simple and pure and that good intentions were enough to protect you from harm. That version of me died the day Marcus left, and in her place emerged someone more cautious, more aware, more protective of herself. I miss the openness and trust that used to come naturally to me, but I also appreciate the wisdom and discernment I've gained through this experience. I'm more careful now about who I let into my life, more attentive to red flags, more willing to trust my instincts when something feels off. And maybe most importantly, I've learned that being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who hurts you, that there's no shame in walking away from something that doesn't serve you, that your worth is not determined by whether someone chooses to love you. It's been almost a year now since the wedding that never happened. and I'm in a much better place than I was in those dark days immediately after Marcus left. I've returned to therapy, I've reconnected with friends and family, I've thrown myself into my work and hobbies, I've started to rebuild my life with intention and purpose. I even went on a few dates recently, though I'm taking things very slowly and being very selective about who I spend time with. I'm not in a rush to find another relationship because I've learned that being comfortable and happy alone is essential before you can be truly healthy with someone else. I have hope for my future now. Real, genuine hope that I didn't have for months after the wedding disaster. I believe that someday I'll find someone who deserves my love and who will treat me with the respect and honesty that I should have demanded from Marcus. I believe that this experience, as painful as it was, has taught me valuable lessons about myself and about relationships that will serve me well for the rest of my life. And I believe that everything really does happen for a reason. Not because there's some cosmic plan that dictates our suffering, but because we have the power to find meaning and growth in even the worst experiences if we're willing to do the difficult work of healing and reflection. So if you're going through something similar, if you've been hurt or betrayed or left by someone you loved, please hear me when I say that it gets better. It might not feel like it will ever get better. You might think that you'll never recover from this pain, but I promise you that time and support and self-compassion will eventually heal wounds that feel impossible to survive right now. And if you're in a relationship where you're seeing red flags, where you feel controlled or isolated or afraid, please listen to those instincts and get out before it's too late. Don't make the excuses I made. Don't rationalize away behaviors that make you uncomfortable. Don't stay because you've already invested so much time and energy into the relationship. Your safety, your peace, your happiness are worth more than any relationship, no matter how much you love the person or how much you want to believe they'll change. And if you know someone who might be in a dangerous or unhealthy relationship, reach out to them. Let them know you're there to support them without judgment. Help them see what they might not be able to see for themselves. Sometimes we need outside perspective to recognize what we've been conditioned to accept as normal. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that turned out to be a blessing in disguise? Have you ever dodged a bullet in a relationship? Have you ever had that moment where you looked back and realized that what seemed like the worst thing that ever happened to you actually saved you from something much worse? Share your stories because I think there's power in knowing we're not alone in these experiences, in understanding that surviving heartbreak and betrayal makes us stronger and wiser rather than weaker or damaged. If this story resonated with you at all, if you found yourself relating to any part of my experience, if you learned something about recognizing red flags or trusting your instincts, please leave a like on this video because it helps share this message with more people who might need to hear it. And please subscribe to I Live to Tell because we share real stories from real people about surviving the unthinkable and finding strength in the aftermath. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change your perspective or even save your life. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And remember that sometimes what breaks your heart is exactly what sets you free.